History class taught you dates, names, victories, but it rarely taught you what those victories cost. Picture this: a narrow street packed wall to wall with people. The air is heavy, not with celebration, but with hunger. Children sit on stone steps too weak to cry. Adults stare into the distance, waiting for help that will never come. This moment existed. It was documented. And yet, in most classrooms, it never happened. Because history, as we are taught it, is not a record of everything that occurred. It is a curated story, trimmed, polished, and carefully edited. Empires rise, civilizations advance, progress marches forward. But beneath those clean timelines lie darker chapters: mass deaths reduced to footnotes, suffering explained away as necessary, entire populations erased from the narrative. And once you see those patterns, you start noticing them everywhere. So tonight, we are not revisiting the history you memorized. We are opening the pages that were skipped. Not myths, not conspiracies, but documented events that were too inconvenient, too uncomfortable, or too damaging to national pride to be fully taught in school. And once you understand why they were hidden, you will never read a history book the same way again. Every nation teaches history, but no nation teaches all of it. Curriculums are built with limits: limited time, limited space, and limited tolerance for controversy. So choices are made. Some stories are highlighted, others are simplified, and some are quietly left out altogether. Not always out of malice, but often out of comfort. History lessons are designed to create cohesion, to build identity, to offer heroes instead of uncomfortable truths. This is why most school textbooks focus on founding moments, triumphs and discoveries, clear villains and clear victories. But real history is rarely that clean, because for every empire that expanded, someone was conquered. For every industrial breakthrough, someone paid the price in labor, land, or life. And for every golden age, there were shadows deliberately kept off the page. To understand how this works, we need to look at history not as a timeline, but as a filter shaped by governments, cultural memory, political stability, and the fear of reopening old wounds. This filtering process doesn't erase events completely, it shrinks them. A famine becomes a difficult period. Forced labor becomes economic restructuring. Mass death becomes a statistic, if it's mentioned at all. And nowhere is this pattern clearer than in the age of empire. When empires are taught in schools, they are often framed as engines of progress. They built roads, they unified regions, they spread technology, language, and law. But what happens when we shift the camera away from the capitals and toward the people living at the edges of those empires? Because that is where the darker history begins. In the next part, we'll examine what empire actually looked like on the ground through labor camps, famine policies, and decisions made far from the people they destroyed. In the first case, begins with an empire often remembered not for what it took, but for what it claimed to give. When empires are discussed in classrooms, they're often framed as engines of order. They build roads. They introduce new systems of law. They connect distant regions into vast trade networks. On paper, expansion looks efficient, almost inevitable. But expansion is never experienced on paper. It is experienced by people. And when we shift our perspective away from royal courts and official records, the story begins to change. In the 19th century, one of the most powerful empires on Earth governed territories spanning continents. From its capital, decisions were made that affected millions of lives, thousands of miles away. Among those territories were regions that had been self-sustaining for centuries, places with established agriculture, local governance, and deeply rooted cultural systems. Yet when imperial economic policies were imposed, those systems began to strain. In several documented cases, local crops were redirected toward export markets rather than local consumption. Food that once stayed within communities was shipped outward, converted into profit, and counted as economic success. But statistics rarely show empty granaries. When harvests failed, as they inevitably do in any agricultural society, the buffer that once protected local populations had already been weakened. Eyewitness accounts from the period described entire districts where food prices rose beyond what ordinary people could afford. Relief efforts, where they existed, were often delayed by bureaucracy or constrained by policy decisions made far from the crisis itself. The result was not a single dramatic moment, but a slow collapse. Markets still operated, railways still moved goods, official reports still spoke of stability. Meanwhile, families sold possessions just to buy a few days of food. In some regions, travelers recorded seeing roads lined with people too weak to continue walking. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe that could be blamed solely on nature. It was the intersection of environmental stress and administrative choices. And yet, in many textbooks, these events are compressed into a brief paragraph, if they appear at all, described simply as a period of famine. No mention of policy debates, no exploration of conflicting reports from officials on the ground, just a date, a number, and a transition to the next chapter. But resource extraction was not the only shadow that followed expansion. Labor itself became a currency of empire. Across multiple regions and time periods, large infrastructure projects required enormous workforces: roads, plantations, mines, railways. On paper, these projects symbolized progress. In reality, many relied on systems that blurred the line between employment and coercion. Workers were sometimes bound by contracts they could not easily leave. Local authorities, under pressure to meet quotas, enforced recruitment aggressively. In certain documented cases, failure to supply labor or resources resulted in punishment or loss of land. These systems did not always resemble outright slavery as it is commonly imagined, but they created conditions where individuals had little practical choice. Production increased, exports rose, economic indicators improved, but those numbers rarely reflected the conditions of the people generating them. Letters from administrators occasionally acknowledged exhaustion, disease, and high mortality among workers, yet such details were often buried within technical reports. Over time, the official narrative emphasized the completed railway, the expanded port, the rising output. The cost of building them became a footnote. And then there were moments when violence was not indirect or systemic, but immediate. Throughout history, protests against taxation, land seizures, or labor demands sometimes escalated into confrontation. When authorities perceived unrest as a threat to stability, responses could be swift and overwhelming. Archival records from different regions describe gatherings that began as demonstrations. Unarmed civilians assembled to voice grievances. In several cases, those gatherings ended with mass casualties. What is striking reading those accounts side by side is not just the events themselves, but how differently they were described depending on the source. Eyewitness testimony might speak of confusion, panic, and indiscriminate force. Official summaries often used language like restoration of order. The same event, two entirely different narratives. In many classrooms, such incidents are either briefly mentioned or omitted entirely in favor of broader political developments. But on the ground, these moments were defining. They shaped how entire populations viewed authority for generations. Each of these examples, resource extraction, coerced labor, violent suppression, appeared in different places under different flags across different centuries. The details change. The pattern does not. Power expands. Resources are redirected. Resistance emerges. Force is applied. And afterward, the official record emphasizes stability restored and progress achieved. But the darkest chapter is not only what happened in those moments, it is what happened afterward. Because once the immediate crisis passed, something else began: the rewriting. In the years following many of these events, investigations were sometimes launched, committees gathered testimony, reports were compiled, statistics were reviewed. At first glance, this looks like accountability, but the language used in final publications often shifted the emphasis. Instead of assigning responsibility, conclusions might highlight unavoidable circumstances. Environmental factors were emphasized, logistical limitations were cited. Policy decisions that had been debated fiercely in internal correspondence were summarized in neutral terms. In some cases, reports that contained harsher criticisms were delayed, edited, or released with limited circulation. Public memory began to form not from the raw evidence, but from the version deemed acceptable for broad distribution. School curricula, developed decades later, often relied on those sanitized summaries. Over time, complex and painful events were condensed into a few lines. A famine became a challenge of administration. A massacre became an incident. Forced labor became mobilization. None of these words are technically false, but they remove the human experience. They transform lived suffering into abstract terminology. And once language changes, perception follows. Generations grow up understanding the expansion of power as largely orderly and beneficial, with only occasional disturbances. The archival record still exists: letters, diaries, independent journalism, but accessing it requires effort few students are ever guided to make. This is how entire chapters fade, without ever being fully erased, not through conspiracy alone, but through gradual simplification. History does not become more accurate by focusing only on triumph. It becomes more accurate by holding multiple truths at once. Empires did build infrastructure. They also caused displacement. Industrial systems did increase production. They also created environments where exploitation could flourish. Acknowledging this complexity does not erase achievements, it places them in context. In recent decades, historians, educators, and communities have worked to recover voices that were previously ignored. Archives, once considered obscure, are now digitized. Memorials have been constructed where none existed before. Debates continue, not because history is being rewritten, but because it is being examined more completely. Understanding these darker chapters does something important. It shifts history from a story about distant figures into a record of human consequences. And once those consequences are visible, patterns become easier to recognize. The past stops being a closed book, it becomes a guide. If you value history that goes beyond timelines and explores the realities behind them, consider continuing with the next episode in this series. In the description, you'll find links to primary sources and further reading so you can examine the evidence yourself. And if you want more long-form documentaries that uncover overlooked chapters of our past, you can subscribe to follow future releases. Because the more perspectives we include, the closer we get, not to a perfect version of history, but to a more honest one.